I spent the last hour, Maureen, talking about the EPA shutting down our power grid to the point that, I don't know if you know this, that America is right on the edge. We are maxed out. Too bad we don't have a bunch of other power plants running out there. And they're primarily going after the coal industry. And wouldn't you know it, at this time, I mean, I expected a conservative governor of a conservative state to give a state of the state address that said, well, since we're in danger because of, gas and oil, it has a glut right now, and the EPA is shutting down coal plants, we're just going to cut back and conserve in the state of Wyoming. But that's not what happened.
No, right now here down in Cheyenne at the legislature, we're deep in the budgeting process, and the fiscal outlook for the state has changed tremendously since the budget was passed back last January. So January 2014, they passed a 2-year budget for 2015 and 2016. And in the state, I think it's in most states, the legislature has to pass a balanced budget. So, I mean, the deficit or surplus at the end of the session last year was 0. Well, in the October Consensus Revenue Estimating Group report, what it showed was a deficit of $4.4 million. If you're talking about a general fund budget of about 3.8 or 9 billion, that's not really a bad thing, but it's still a deficit, and you can't have a deficit. So you would expect then the governor to come out in his State of the State address and say, well, we need to cut back. Well, he didn't. Now, just very late last week, after we talked you or Amy talked last week, the CREG, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, or the CREG, came out with their January 2015 report. And what it shows is the state is falling off the fiscal cliff. That little 4.4 million you really could think about it as a rounding error, jumped to a deficit of 222 million. So as a result, what we're calling for is not only a rejection of new spending by the governor and by legislators. What we really need to start looking at is where in current budgets are these agencies going to cut so that we can come back to a balanced budget here.
Not to get you off track, just curious, does Medicaid expansion include new spending in your mind?
Well, it would include new spending, of course, even though a lot of people talk about how, you've got 100% coverage from the federal government on new patients that come in of a certain type. That doesn't mean that you have no state spending. And of course, the very first thing you're going to get is higher administration costs. No, I mean, there's a lot of new spending involved in that, and I think we can probably be pretty clear pretty sure given the, not 100% sure, mind you, but fairly sure given this fiscal state of distress that we're in at the moment, that we could look at least a delay in the discussion on this Medicaid expansion. I think what we've got here essentially is this CREG group, the Revenue Estimating Group, made just a tad of a mistake when they were looking at oil prices throughout the biennium and even in future bienniums, because what we've seen is obviously, as everybody who watches the news at all knows, is a dramatic reduction in oil prices. And the reason that this is important here in Wyoming is that 70% of the budget, so 70% of spending that the government does is either minerals, so severance tax, federal mineral royalties, somehow or another mineral related, or legacy minerals. Now those are investment earnings that we get from the Wyoming Mineral Permanent Trust Fund. So what the legislature did earlier this week was have 2 oil and gas industry analysts come in and give them and anyone who else was interested an update on what was happening in the crude oil market. So the main question they were asking was, what's going on? What has caused this tremendous drop in prices? And of course, what's going to happen? How long are they going to stay low? And what's going to happen in the future? And so what is that going to mean for future oil and budgets? So one of the things that one of the analysts said was, what we get in the oil and gas market is very quick correction. So you can get a balancing over a very short period of time. And what this really is a sort of an economics 100 discussion. So, because we know in the market, the supply and demand have to balance or work towards some kind of a balance. That balance, or the move towards that balance, equals price. And of course, balance is complicated by other things like weather, financial markets, geopolitics, taxation, regulation, and all of that. But what we're seeing right now in the oil market worldwide is stagnating or even falling demand and increasing supply. And so when supply is high, demand is low, what you get is a falling price. So on the demand side, it's actually kind of an interesting story. The largest consumers of hydrocarbons are the U.S. and Europe. And the U.S. is in pretty good shape, but the rest of the world is having a few issues. You've got stagnation in the Eurozone and Japan because, of course, what they're doing is this money supply creation or this quantitative easing. And so Europe has got a big plan for that. So we could expect the economic growth to remain stagnant or even decline. Or we can foresee continued problems in Europe, just like we've seen in Japan, because that's essentially what they've been doing is creating a continuous supply of new money. We've got problems in China, a stagnating economy there. You've got conflict in places like Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine. And what you've got here in the U.S., of course, are low interest rates, but a very strong dollar. Now, I don't know if people really remember what was going on about 4 or 5 years ago, but the U.S. dollar was actually quite low. The Canadian dollar was actually above par. So the Canadian dollar was valued higher than the U.S. dollar, and that hadn't happened since the 1970s. This was an amazing thing. At that time, then, what people need to remember is that oil is traded in the world market and it's priced in U.S. dollars. So you've got countries like Venezuela and Libya and, of course, Saudi Arabia. They're selling now their commodity, their oil, in U.S. dollars, and they're getting less money back. So what they need, they want a certain amount of revenue in their own currency. If the value of the U.S. dollar is low, that means they're getting less revenue in their currency, so they need the price of oil in U.S. dollars to be higher. So the price of oil in dollars went very high when the U.S. dollar was low. Now the U.S. dollar is high, the price of oil is going back down again, and so there's that thing there as well. But the other thing he talked about that was kind of interesting is the structural underemployment or unemployment problem that we have here in the U.S. Even though you've got a strong growth in jobs, the labor market itself is very lackluster. So there's slack in the labor market. You know, although somebody might want to move from part-time to full-time, they don't seem to be going there because wages are just not moving upwards. So there's no wage pressure in the market to bring people off the sidelines. And they don't actually see an increase in demand until at least the middle of this year. That's the earliest we might see some kind of recovery in demand, but who knows? Because meanwhile, on the supply side, we've got big increases in non-OPEC countries. That's in particular Canada and the U.S. Canadian and U.S. production was up 4.6 million barrels per day since it bottomed out in 2009, and this is led particularly by technological gains in shale oil. So we've got a big increase in supply in the U.S. and Canada, and supply outside the U.S. has not been contributing to any growth. So Senator Bebout, for instance, asked how much oversupply do we actually have in the world market, and the analyst said, well, it was about 1 to 2 million barrels per day of oversupply. Prices aren't going to recover until that shuts down. And of course, the other thing is that, you know, the reason that we've got higher production here in North America is because of this technological advance in shale gas. The other question was, well, is this technology going to start moving out of North America and going into other places? Well, yes, it probably is. What's that going to mean then for supply in the oil and gas market?
Well, and so much of Wyoming's rainy day fund is invested away, and a lot of predictions have been made on what that rainy day fund was going to do as it's invested away. So that affects this fund as well, even money, because, you know, remember the discussion we had last time you were on, what constitutes, the governor was asking, a rainy day. Well, you got to take a look at what's going to be in that fund, because if it hits us hard enough, it could even, our rainy day fund could even take a loss.
Well, yeah, it was the parts that are invested could take a hit, depending on what happens in the market. That's absolutely true. But we've got, you know, the state treasurer, Mark Gordon, is a really savvy guy. He's looking at doing different things to sort of just
Good.
distribute that fund into other things to try to protect it. Because, of course, those earnings in the Permanent Mineral Wyoming Trust Fund and the Common School Land Permanent Fund and all these other different funds, that's a big part of the revenues that the state depends on. And, in fact, I think really what the state should be doing is looking at reducing taxes, and even though we're looking at a big reduction in revenues, we really need to start taking a closer look at how we're going to manage our finances here. Are we going to continue to depend on the cyclical industry? Should we really ramp up spending like we did over the last 10 years when we get big increases in revenue, only then to have a big drop-off like we had back in the 80s? I mean, we're really heading towards a scenario that was very similar to what we had in the 80s. We had huge reduction in revenue from the mineral industry, and it was they had to make a lot of cuts in government. So instead of having a government that cycles along with the cyclical industry, why don't we try to have a little bit more stability and stop ramping up government whenever we have more money, only to have to cut way back when we don't.
Well, and it seems to me, I might be overstating this, but I just get this idea that, Governor Matt Mead in his first term bragged that, hey, look how much savings have gone up. Look how much money we put aside here. Why we've done so well. Well, it seems to me like the state did so well because we had it so good and so much money was flooding in. The real test of this governor for fiscal responsibility is going to be, if we hit tough times, does he know enough to make cutbacks? Because it doesn't sound like he knows that at all, knows how to do that with the last State of the State address that he gave.
No, you're absolutely right. Because it's not just this year that the CREG is looking at a deficit. So their deficit is biennium. So the 15-16 biennium is a deficit of $222 million. But the 17-18 biennium budget is looking at a deficit of $338 million. And in fact, the forecast price of oil out to 2020 is lower than this October 14 CREG forecast. And what that has got to start doing is pushing government spending down as well. So the October 2014 forecast for the price of oil was $85 a barrel for the entire 2015 year. January 2015 forecast for oil for all of 2015 now sits at $50 a barrel. Now remember that for every $5 reduction in the price of oil, state revenues fall by $35 million. So that means the impact of the state from this decline would be $245 million for this year alone. And that actually could get a lot worse, because I'm not sure what the price of oil is today, but it's been down to $38, $39 a barrel. If it stays down there, this revenue deficit is going to be even worse. So we need to start looking at where are we going to start cutting back, what are we going to start doing to ensure that our children and grandchildren aren't left with a legacy of debt and even maybe higher taxes in the future. Well, what the governor needs to do is, instead of asking for more money, he needs to start looking at where things are going to be cut. Now, I'm not hopeful on this, but the legislature so far in the Joint Appropriations Committee has been showing quite a bit of restraint. Now, you got to remember that the government's main spending accounts, are the general fund and the budget reserve account. They get most of their money from severance taxes, federal mineral revenues, which are severance taxes on federal land, and also sales taxes. And you were talking a little bit earlier on today about the situation with local government. Now, sales, they get a share of the sales tax. And what the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group has shown is that sales tax revenue is still expected to be $8.6 million higher for the 15-16 biennium. But that's not all good news, because what it's showing is that although sales tax revenue should be about $18.8 million higher in 2015, falling oil prices will eventually trickle through the economy and hit sales tax revenue. And we've discussed this before. The mineral industry purchases account for about 30% of sales tax revenue, and so depending on how much mineral industry activity, sales, and all that is happening in the county, like the county where you are, that's going to be a higher percentage or a lower percentage. In the Toronto County, for instance, the minerals industry doesn't account for as much as the retail industry, but for most other counties, the minerals industry accounts for a larger percentage of the sales tax revenue. So if the minerals industry is doing less out in the oil fields, it also means they're buying less stuff. That means sales tax revenue is also going to go down, and that's going to hit the bottom line of local government. That means that this double whammy that I was talking about, where we've got falling minerals and sales tax revenue at the same time, hits in 2016 when sales tax revenue is supposed to fall by 10.2 million. So it's not just the state government that needs to tighten its belt; it's the local government as well.
Yeah, and part of what I had sent to you earlier today goes right along with not just the money that comes in from the state or any federal money that might come their way, but also unemployment goes up because, in Casper, from the Casper Star-Tribune, a couple of stories that I read, 2 major companies in that area. One laid off 7,000 people, another's laying off 9,000 people. Those are huge cuts. Now, it's not all in Wyoming. It's across their entire company, which spreads across the nation. But still, that's going to be a lot of local jobs. Whoops, all of a sudden you have people on the Wyoming unemployment rolls and other Wyoming roles for assistance, basically. And that's got to take a bite out, too. They have to consider the help that these people are going to be asking for.
Yeah, that's right. So we need to start seeing less corporate welfare. And actually, one of the things I was really pleased about today is that the supplemental budget request for the Wyoming Business Council of $155,000 that they wanted to use to help companies with their accounting and all this other kind of stuff was turned down by the Joint Appropriations Committee today. So we are seeing some good signs, at least from the legislature. We need to start now seeing more leadership from the governor, and really people can make a difference, and now is the time to call your legislator and let them know what you think about this falling revenue, about what they should be doing about it, about how government needs to tighten its belt. People do make a difference, because after all, I realize we did just have an election, but in another 2 years, another election is going to come around, not for the governor, but for a lot of the legislators. And so people can, and especially if we look at the trend of minerals revenue, and then, of course, sales tax revenue, those are trending downwards. That's starting to trend downwards now. These things are going to take a while to turn around. So by the time the next election comes around, we could still be in a downturn. So people will be able to hold their legislators accountable. So it's important for them to let their legislators know now what road they should be taking. And we need to start looking to legislators to be more fiscally conservative, because certainly we're not seeing that from the governor.
Absolutely not. Where do they find the article that you just wrote about this?
Yeah, you can find out more on our website, wyliberty.org, falling off the fiscal cliff. You can see all the details there, and certainly you can read more of our articles. We've got lots of stuff going on at the legislature right now.
Thanks for coming on, Maureen.
Always great to be here.